The idea that globalization shook identity suggests a cause we can name and an effect we can trace, as if something once solid were struck by a single, visible force. Yet when the historical record is approached closely, the certainty dissolves. Identity does not appear as a stable object that can be displaced, nor does globalization arrive as a unified event. What remains instead are fragments, shifts without clear beginnings, losses without documented moments of departure, and emotional residues whose origins cannot be cleanly located. The assumption that identity was once coherent enough to be shaken already strains under inspection. Archives preserve movements of goods more reliably than movements of meaning. Shipping logs record tonnage and destination. Trade agreements preserve clauses and signatures. Migration records list numbers, ages, ports of entry. But the interior experience that later becomes described as dislocation rarely survives in comparable form. Letters thin out. Diaries stop mid-sentence. Oral accounts arrive decades later, already shaped by hindsight and repetition. What globalization seems to disrupt most clearly is not identity itself, but the ability to observe identity forming without interruption. The physical terrain of globalization is easier to establish. Container ports expanded along predictable coastlines. Fiber optic cables followed seabeds and borders drawn for other purposes. Currency regimes synchronized. Supply chains stretched across latitudes, converting distance into delay rather than separation. These developments are well documented, charted in graphs and maps that show acceleration and density. Yet none of these records explain how individuals understood themselves while these structures settled into place. The terrain is visible. The interior adjustment is not. Census categories changed during this period, but the changes tell us little about how people inhabited them. New classifications appeared, cations. Old ones were merged or removed. In some regions, ethnic or occupational labels hardened under administrative pressure. In others, they blurred. The records show revision, not reception. We can see when a category was introduced, but not how it felt to be assigned to it, or to discover that a previous label no longer fit the available forms. As trade intensified, local production often narrowed rather than expanded. Specialization increased efficiency but reduced redundancy. Communities became dependent on distant systems they could not see. This dependence is measurable in price fluctuations and employment patterns. What is not preserved is the gradual emotional recalibration that followed. At what point did familiarity give way to uncertainty? When did adaptation stop feeling voluntary? The sources are silent on thresholds, offering only outcomes after the fact. Language itself began to thin in the record. Multilingual competence expanded in urban centers while disappearing in rural margins. Translation multiplied, but so did standardization. Words survived, but contexts narrowed. The emotional weight of certain terms, home, work, belonging, shifted unevenly across regions, yet these shifts were rarely noted when they occurred. They surfaced later as nostalgia or resentment, already abstracted from their original moments. Globalization produced abundance alongside disappearance. Goods became more accessible while practices became less legible. Crafts vanished without formal documentation. Informal economies adapted without leaving ledgers. The loss was often registered only when revival was attempted and failed. At that point, identity is described as having been shaken, but the shaking itself is absent from the record. Education systems adjusted curricula to match global standards. This alignment is traceable through policy documents and testing frameworks. What cannot be reconstructed is how students experienced the gradual removal of local reference points. Did it feel like expansion or replacement? The evidence does not decide. Personal testimonies conflict, and those that survive are already shaped by later debates about globalization's meaning. The emotional cost appears most clearly where measurement fails. Anxiety rises in surveys, but surveys presuppose categories of feeling. Terms like alienation or loss enter usage after the conditions they describe have already been normalized. By the time they are named, they are no longer new. The cost is recorded indirectly as increased mobility, delayed family formation, or political volatility. None of these confirm a singular emotional experience. They only indicate strain. In many regions, identity hardened rather than dissolved. Markers became more explicit, not less. Flags, rituals, and boundaries intensified. This is often interpreted as reaction, but the sequence is unclear. Did identity fracture first, prompting consolidation, or did consolidation occur as part of the same structural shift? The records allow for both readings and settle on neither. Digital communication complicates the archive further. Expression proliferated, but preservation did not keep pace. Platforms rose and fell. Early digital traces decayed or were erased. What survives is uneven. Fragments of forums, curated profiles, partial datasets. The emotional adjustments made in these spaces, experiments with self-presentation, belonging, anonymity, are largely irretrievable. Identity may have been reshaped there, but the evidence has already thinned beyond recovery. At a certain point, the question shifts. It becomes unclear whether globalization shook identity, or whether it exposed the instability that was already present, but previously unobservable. Earlier periods appear stable partly because their records are sparse. Silence can resemble coherence when there is nothing to contradict it. As documentation increases, contradiction multiplies. What looks like erosion may be visibility. This uncertainty sharpens rather than resolves when examined structurally. Global systems reduce variance in some dimensions while amplifying it in others. They standardize interfaces but fragment experience. Individuals encounter the same brands and platforms while interpreting them through local histories that remain undocumented. Identity, in this view, is neither lost nor preserved, but continuously reassembled under conditions that leave no stable trace. The fracture emerges here, not as a moment, but as a limit. If identity's transformation cannot be located in time, measured in intensity, or reconstructed from records, what exactly is being mourned when its loss is claimed? Is the grief attached to an actual prior state, or to the absence of evidence that such a state ever existed in coherent form? The record offers no answer. It only shows accumulation without interior narration. Structures advance, interfaces spread, emotional language follows at a distance, already generalized. What remains is a sense of cost without a ledger, change without a baseline, and memory without a stable object. The echo that follows does not clarify. It lingers in the gap between what can be traced and what was lived. Globalization continues to generate records, more data, more connectivity, more measurable flows, while the emotional adjustments it requires remain largely unarchived. Identity is said to be shaken, but the shaking leaves no clear imprint, only a widening silence where explanation might have been expected, and where certainty, once assumed, continues to thin rather than return. If this reflection resonated with you, you can find more explorations like this on Timeless Questions, where history, power, and human nature quietly intersect.